Welcome to a new episode of the Superpowered Fancast. This is Darren. David Pepose is back on the Fancast this episode to talk about his work, including the next arc for Space Ghost for Dynamite Entertainment, as well as pitching the new Captain Planet series coming to Dynamite. Well, it's already here, and the upcoming return of Speed Racer to Mad Cave Studios. We discuss the logistics of writing multiple series, as well as his vision for the new iteration of Captain Planet. I absolutely encourage anyone watching or listening to pick up a copy of Captain Planet and let me know what you think. So without further ado, here's my interview with David Pepose. David, thank you so much for coming back on the Superpowered Fancast. I know you are very busy, and I want to talk to you because you're so busy, because you're writing uh, two new comics that I have hit my radar that I'm absolutely loving the first bits of story from.
Yeah.
So I want to jump in, but the first thing I want to say is a congratulations on all the success. I'm
Thank you.
loving Space Ghost so much.
Thank you. We're having a lot of fun working on that book, and it really means the world to see that people seem to be responding to it. And, I know there was a little bit of a gap between our last issue and this one. It's the distribution of it all. But I think people will hopefully see this week the gap between issues 11 and 12 were definitely worth the wait, because we've got some really fun stuff coming in issue 12 and our upcoming Space Ghost Annual, which is coming out I believe in June. And That's going to really kick off some interesting cliffhangers that are going to really inform the next batch of stories down the line.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in that series, but it happens in such an organic way that it just like every story beat kind of keeps me interested because I'm loving not only the villains and seeing them team up, but also seeing how Space Ghost is dealing with it, seeing how the kids are dealing with it, seeing how him dealing with the kids. Like there's a lot going on, but it never feels overwhelming. Is that like how do you kind of thread the needle story wise to have kind
Or,
of so much going on with
well, I think a lot of it comes down to structure, knowing that we sort of have a little bit of a formula going with the series, and that every issue has its villain of the month, or if it's a two-parter, and then we also have a subplot going on that is something to do with Space Ghost's ongoing dynamic with the kids. Because I think that's like the engine that kind of drives everything. That's the soap opera that like keeps people interested, and to have these three characters, it's really nice to have them kind of bounce off each other and have them triangulate a little bit. And comparing this to say something I'm doing on Captain Planet, which has a bigger cast, I've learned that having that three-man group, there's like something special about that number, that it's big enough that it can still serve as kind of an ensemble piece, but also it's small and intimate enough that you have a lot of room to kind of develop some of that stuff. And so for me, it's always been about, okay, I knew the landmarks in terms of the villains. How can I kind of arrange them? How can I compose them in such a way that I can then thread in these various character beats and figure out how do I kind of organically build it to something bigger? I've been fortunate knowing that like the Council of Doom has always been the plan.
Mhm.
And knowing that, well, I'm not going to spoil anything, but you'll see what RoboCore's ultimate plans are at the end of issue 12. And we teased that a little bit in an earlier issue. So yeah, I think weirdly enough, it's actually been a little easier to kind of build up by doing done in ones and done in twos versus something like Captain Planet, where like that we've got a big 6 issue origin story, and for a variety of different reasons, both because of the size of the cast, but also the way you want to sort of thread in Captain Planet enough times, but not so much that it overwhelms the whole story.
Right.
That becomes actually a sort of more like an 18 wheeler where it's a little harder to maneuver. You have to sort of plan your whole story accordingly. Space Ghost, I think by virtue of the quick in and out, we're able to sort of say, okay, like what's the subplot here, and
Mhm.
what are the character beats? How can we show that these characters have evolved and moved on? And so we've got some fun developments coming, particularly in Space Ghost Annual. So definitely keep your eyes peeled, because that's going to really set the tone for year two.
Well, I'm definitely looking forward to it because again, I've loved the build up and both the tone and how the tone changes based on both not only the angst of the character, but also having him put into this
Yeah.
father figure role. Like he has to kind of wear two hats. So it's really interesting to see those dynamics play out. So it's one of the reasons why I look forward to each issue because I like seeing them.
They're a fun cast of characters, and I think the fun thing about Space Ghost, and it's kind of the fun thing about a lot of these nostalgia books, is that the original source material was there, but like it was definitely considered more simplistic in terms of the storytelling compared to like today's standards. And also, a lot of people they either know these characters, some of them are diehards and they know the mythology, encyclopedically, but most of them it's sort of a half remembered sort of thing, like. They've got good associations from their childhood, but they don't know like the intricacies of it. Or sometimes they only know these characters through cultural osmosis. I can certainly say that was my introduction to Speed Racer.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that actually works in our favor, is that because I've done the homework, I've watched every episode of these shows. You can kind of then like figure out, okay, what are the qualities that stand out that make the thing endure, but also what are little things that stand out to me in terms of the qualities, and
Right.
how can I put a modern twist on it, and how can I then kind of remix all of that into something that is accessible, whether or not you've watched the cartoon. But for the people who have grown up with these cartoons, then they're like, oh, seeing it with modern storytelling techniques, it feels like these shows have uh, matured along with us. And so it
Mhm.
really does become kind of a win-win. It's very accessible for diehards and newcomers alike. But also, like, it gives me a lot of freedom as a storyteller to kind of interpret these things through my own lens and what I think is like, what's the most exciting way we can tell this story? What's the most accessible way we can tell this story? What's the most relevant way we can tell this story? And I try to do all that to the best of my abilities. And so far, seeing the responses to Space Ghost and now Captain Planet and now Speed Racer, it seems to be paying off so far.
Yeah, and along those same lines, especially talking about nostalgia, like how does the pitch for a Captain Planet series kind of work? Like was it something that you found relatively easy to kind of package
Yeah.
for the company, or was it something where you ran into a little bit of resistance both personally or
No. Well, it's funny. Captain Planet's been my white whale for as long as I've been in the industry.
Mm,
It's funny. We announced the book just the day after the inauguration, and that was actually the day before the 10-year anniversary of me messaging my best friend and saying, somebody should really do a Captain Planet reboot. Like it, the universe works in strange ways. But I think for me, I've always seen the potential behind the concept. And so I've pitched this book to just about every publisher in the industry, including Dynamite before this, before they picked up the rights. I um I get that Captain Planet often gets a bad rap for being very much a product of its time,
mm,
1990s edutainment. And maybe people say that its politics weren't necessarily subtle. And my response to that is reality has gotten a lot less subtle in the last few years. And I think any property that has sort of that enduring fan base, you can modernize it. I mean, one of my favorite movies is the first J.J. Abrams Star Trek, and that's because I didn't have any affection for Kirk and Spock. But then when I saw that movie, I was like, oh, it's accessible. I get it. I like these characters. I understand where they're coming from. And so, Captain Planet, the way that book actually wound up happening, it was at San Diego Comic-Con last year. I'm obviously I'm writing Space Ghost over at Dynamite, and I saw they sent out a press release saying, "Hey, we're expanding our Warner Brothers line, including Captain Planet." And so I marched over. I was at BarCon at San Diego when I saw this, and I saw our publisher Nick Barucci at the same bar, and I just marched over with my cell phone, and I was like, "Do you have anybody writing on this? Like, if you don't, let me throw my hat in the ring. I got a pitch that'll make your toes curl." And then I ran into my editor, my Space Ghost editor, Joe Rybant, at another party at San Diego, and I told him the exact same thing. And so it really kind of worked out. It was like just right place, right time, right publisher. Um, but yeah, honestly, it went really smoothly. I think beyond just like hammering out like the story math of it all, and I can go into that in a little bit, but I didn't get any pushback. Dynamite's been amazing. Warner Brothers has been super supportive of this book. I want to give a shout out to Megan Logan over there at Warner Brothers because she's sort of been like our point person, and she's just been really supportive of the whole thing. Like I think they've given me. I'm about to start writing issue 6. They've given me one note so far. Um, and it was for the better. And actually, I will tell you exactly what that note is. Because the preview page is out. It was literally the opening of issue 2. That was a recommendation from Warner Brothers. Was like, hey, could we throw in a little more mythology for Captain Planet? And so that became our introduction. It's not a spoiler. You can see it online now. But like, Captain Planet trying to stop the eruption in Pompeii. Trying, saving like a Chinese fisherman in the North China Sea from a tsunami, stopping British poachers in Kenya in the early 1900s. It's kind of cool to be able to like say like, oh, this immortal demigod, like, of course he's got a past, of course he's got history, of course he's popped up, just before we were really keeping good records of those sorts of things.
Right.
So, yeah, I think the challenge for Captain Planet, I think for me, is it's a very different type of story than something that than a traditional superhero team. There's something that's very much in the spirit of like the Forever People, if you're a diehard DC fan, in that if you haven't watched Captain Planet, it's about five ordinary people from around the world getting the five elemental rings of Gaia. And if they use them in unison, they can summon this immortal elemental champion known as Captain Planet.
Mhm.
However, um, you know, even though Captain Planet is the title character, it's always very much been the Planeteers story. If you've watched any episode of that show, because you can't just summon a genie and wish your problems away. Like that's the whole point of the show and the themes is that like the power is yours. It's people like you and me on the ground level. And so you have to really kind of structure your story around that of how do you show enough Captain Planet that it's interesting and that you're selling what's on the tin, but at the same time that you're not just sidelining this entire cast of characters that are supposed to be your point of view.
Right.
And so that was that was a trickier needle to thread than I had anticipated. So I really hammered out a lot of my outline in terms of that's the that's the landmarks is when does Cap show up, but also how do you give him threats that are appropriate to his power level, but at the same time, like how do you make sure that he doesn't completely like just steal the whole thing? So
Right.
I'm really happy with the way that we've structured it, but that was I'd say the biggest challenge behind all that. But thankfully it was really buoyed by just it's a fun cast of characters. Like they all have
Mhm.
very distinct personalities. They've got strong backgrounds and particular individual contexts, and they all fit into the greater environmental conversation, but at different angles.
Right.
So I think that was the selling point to me was, I mean, Captain Planet is a very fun character to write as well. And he sort of serves as this like fatherly mentor figure.
Mhm.
Brian Cronin at CBR gave us a huge compliment in a review where he compared him to Christopher Reeve's Superman. And I think that's definitely Superman. I pitched him as Superman with metamorphose powers, but the Planeteers themselves are, for me, that's the draw. They are
Yeah.
such a fun group. They have such strong personalities. Watching them bounce off each other and play off each other, you're going to see that a lot in issue 2. I think that's issue 2 of Captain Planet is probably one of my favorite things I've ever written. And it's because you get to see the sparks fly when the Planeteers meet for the first time.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I've been looking forward to because it's just from reading the first issue, I was like, okay, there's no way all of these characters get along as soon as they meet each other. And
No,
then like some of them some of them take like kind of a really kind of darker, more
yeah,
yeah, more mature bent. And it's
yeah,
I'm interested. And I think that's the reason why I kind of found myself immersed in that first issue is because, from the animated series, you can kind of see how these are just, they're in essence, they're good kids who are trying to
yeah,
do good. And
yeah,
from the comic, you see that these are people and they're dealing with a
yes.
world that is not necessarily good. And as much as they try to do good in it, they're still affected by the world around them. So it's
Yes.
it's interesting to see
You're,
that.
you're, you're dead on. I mean, I think I felt this way about Space Ghost as well, but when you're doing a modernization of one of these nostalgia properties, I think for me the big thing is you just got to wrap your head around it and just like, okay, how does it make sense internally? What are the rules of this world? And also what are the limitations on these characters? Because you want to make sure that they always feel challenged, they always feel on the back foot. And so yeah, for Captain Planet, I mean, not only did we want to kind of give everybody just a historical update, like I said, the original cartoon was set in 1990. Linka is a great example. She was introduced as the Planeteer from the Soviet Union, which, things changed just in the course of the show.
Yeah.
She was the conservative Planeteer. Now, obviously, things have changed in Russia significantly. And
Mm.
so, like, I used the band Pussy Riot as kind of like an inspiration for
I
Linka,
saw
is
that.
like like
Mhm.
anti-establishment, and she's our anarchist, and she's the progressive Planeteer. Um and so she's probably my one of my favorites. But I think it for me it's been like trying to find different ways to sort of shore up what I might consider possible weak spots. And
Mhm.
like for example, Mati. I know a lot of people are like, "Ooh, like Mati, like he's got a harder edge." And I think it's because in the original cartoon, he was this wide-eyed innocent, and so I think he was often seen as a punchline. Like,
Yeah.
oh, the power of heart, like what does that mean? Well, you get to see a little glimpse of that in issue one. He's honestly, I think, the most one of the most interesting characters in the whole book because of the effect that the ring has had on him.
Right.
In that, like he's had a hard life. He was about to do some hard things, and then he gets he gets the ring, and suddenly all that rage, all that all that anger, it vanishes.
Mhm.
It's like that scene in All-Star Superman, where Lex Luthor gets Superman's powers and then he suddenly
Powers.
gets like,
Yeah.
radical empathy. So Mati, he becomes a pacifist over all this. He doesn't throw a punch because he doesn't need to. And you'll see kind of different ways that we leverage the power of heart in this book. And so he's such a fun character. But yeah, I wanted to kind of add a little texture to that, of this idea of like he's had it harder than any of them. And at the same time, this ring has sort of given him a second chance, but also like there's a little bit of a degree of like, you know, did it rewrite him a little bit?
Yeah.
Like I think there's room for some interesting inner conflict for him down the line. Um, Even things like Wheeler was another one that I really wanted to take a crack at, because for me it makes sense that he's the skeptic of the group. He's definitely the most conservative out of all the Planeteers, and I think this is probably, I think, a typical American thing at this point. But it's like he doesn't know a whole lot about a whole lot, and he doesn't feel like he needs to.
Right.
But at the same time, the environmental conversation does have an impact on his career, on his job. He's a we recast him as an auto factory worker in Detroit. And
Mhm.
I really wanted to kind of have that, to kind of lean into that skepticism of the Planeteers' mission, and why does this matter, and why can't we just give this to the authorities? But
Right.
ultimately, his character arc is to justify the whole premise of the book. Like, why does this matter? Like
Mhm.
that, it becomes sort of a dialectical conversation, of like, yeah, I guess it's down to me.
Yeah.
Um, and I think all the Planeteers get to have these kind of fun moments, and not only are we sort of leaning into their agency with their powers, the sort of the Avatar, the last Airbender of it all, but I think seeing these characters, not only giving them extra context, but also kind of, we'll see them flesh out their backstory a bit, and um, but also just, I think trying to make these characters as three-dimensional as we can, I think, is sort of like the goal for this. And that kind of helps shore up, the idea of, oh, this can't be a sophisticated storytelling. Well, it can
Right.
be. This Captain Planet was meant to be the world outside your window. And in
Yeah.
1990, the target demographic was younger children. And I totally understand why. Ted Turner and Barbara Pyle and Nick Boxer, they wanted to, I mean, they wanted to educate a generation of kids,
Mhm.
like, and I think trying to make a generation of kids environmentally conscious was like a really heroic thing to try to do. Now, obviously, as a comic, we don't have that kind of platform. We're sort of targeting, we're targeting the audience that either was around that during that period or at least
Mhm.
is older and more sophisticated. But I think we live in a time where empathy is not a given,
Right.
and that is certainly at a deficit. And the reason I wanted to take on this book, it reminded me of Giant Size X-Men.
Yeah.
All these people coming from different walks of life, and I think that really speaks to me. I grew up as a Jewish kid in Missouri. I
Mhm.
was not part of the. I knew very early on I was not part of the dominant cultural force there,
Right.
and I think that feeling of feeling a little othered, really kind of informed. I always kind of gravitated towards like my fellow outcasts, and
Mhm.
and I think for me, writing something like Captain Planet, it's to try to instill a sense of empathy and to show people that like no matter where we come from, we have more in common than we have apart, and we're always stronger together.
Right.
And if this book can give anybody even just like a little bit of like normalization of just like, oh hey, like, then maybe we've done our job. Now,
Yeah.
granted, I know there's going to be people out there who like, they're either so marinated in sort of the culture wars, or they are, it's part of their business model to complain. And anytime I see those guys complain, honestly, I feel like I've done my job.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I want you to feel something reading this book, and thankfully, the vast, vast, vast majority of people have really understood the vision. Have been really supportive of it. And the few bad apples out there, I'd tell them, touch grass
Right. Well,
from
and
Captain Planet himself.
yeah.
So yeah, but I'm very thrilled with the response to this book for sure.
Yeah, but that's the thing is that, there's no era where empathy is not important. I mean, there's no
Yeah,
time frame for when you can't develop empathy. So yeah, just even as a person, being Gen X, growing up Gen X in the 80s and 90s, and being
yeah,
being a father, there's no reason why you can't either develop or try
yeah,
and try and produce or provide things that can help you develop
yeah,
empathy. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think this story, especially the way you're doing it, is yeah, things are different than they were before. Things are a little bit tougher than they were before. It's not there's not a whole lot of there's no rose colored glasses. Things are just as important, and that's the reason why empathy is more important than it's ever been. So
yeah, yeah. I mean, and I feel like empathy is like empathy and compassion towards other people and sort of coming together with other people. I think that's sort of like it's not a silver bullet to everything that ails us, but I think it would certainly help quite a bit. I think we live in very politically divisive times, thanks to our politically divisive leadership. I think post COVID, like we're more disconnected than ever. And I think social media has sort of, encouraged a lot of people to sort of listen to the demon on their shoulder
yeah,
rather than, their better angels. And so, yeah, I mean, in the same way, like I feel like I understand that if Giant Size X-Men came out today, certain corners of the internet would scream and cry about how woke it is. But like, I don't know. I feel like there's always room to build a bigger table. That's like I say that in every interview because it's really like the core ethos of like how I write in my life, and is
mhm,
that we shouldn't just be preaching to the choir. We should be reaching out for converts
right,
and making the books accessible as possible, and also just anytime we can sort of reflect as many different people and have them be seen as possible, then we've done our job. And I
yeah,
think that's not just like a moral, a concern. I think it's also an aesthetic concern. I think it's so boring to have just like a whole group of white guys. Like I think the proof is in the pudding with Captain Planet, where I'm like, all these characters bring their culture and their origin and their backgrounds with them, and it makes for a more vibrant and interesting book.
right,
Um, I think I was thinking about it the other day, of the success of Dennis Camp's Ultimates book, particularly issues like the She-Hulk issue or the Hawkeye issue. And I think the reason why that book is so popular, beyond sort of the like, oh, it's a new take on a successful character, I think people want to learn something when they
Yeah.
read. It's stimulating when you learn something. And so I think having characters from different backgrounds that helps in that regard, I think. And so, um, yeah, I feel like a book like Captain Planet, it's sort of me trying to put my money where my mouth is a
Hmm.
little bit, but also just trying to say like, hey, like I hope anybody can read this book and feel seen
Right.
in it. And so far, I think we've been hitting the mark.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then with the passion you have for, like, you obviously have
Yeah.
for this story in Captain Planet, what's the emotional connection you have with Speed Racer? Because it looks like
Yeah.
Speed Racer seems to be kind of just from the zero issue that I got on Free Comic Book Day. Just seems to
Yeah.
be like we're just gonna balls to the wall kind of action and thrills in it. So I'm just kind of want to know
Yeah.
where you're like
I,
like why Speed Racer and kind of where you want to go with it.
So, Speed Racer was interesting because similar to, unlike Captain Planet, I grew up watching Captain Planet. I was part of that core demographic. I was like the perfect age to be watching
Mhm.
that. Space Ghost and Speed Racer, obviously I missed when it was in the cultural heyday. I was not born yet.
Mhm.
Um, but when Mad Cave approached me at San Diego Comic-Con last year, it was a very eventful Comic-Con last year.
Yeah.
They said, "Hey, listen, like we've been printing these Gotcha Man comics. They've been very successful.
Mhm.
Our partnership with Tatsunoko has been really good. So we're going to be expanding that. We're going to be acquiring the rights to Speed Racer. And would you have any interest in writing that?" And my editor, Chaz Pangburn, he and I had talked quite a bit since I had worked on The Devil That Wears My Face over at
Right.
Mad Cave. With him sort of being like, "Hey, listen, I'd love to do some licensed work with you." And we could never either lock it down in terms of the schedule, or I didn't really know the IP very well. But when he mentioned Speed Racer, anybody who's read a lot of my early work, I love car chases in comics. I think it's such a fun challenge to convey motion and speed and intensity in a static medium.
Yeah.
But you see when it's done right, it's really cool. Whether it's David Aja's issue of Hawkeye, Trad Moore, an all-timer with Ghost Rider, even not to toot my own horn too much, but George Santiago Jr. and both volumes of Spencer and Locke, we had really
Mhm.
cool car chases in that. Even Devil That Wears My Face, we threw in a carriage chase
Yeah.
sequence. So I love doing that. And the idea of, at the time, it was a 15 issue runway, but then we added another chapter for Free Comic Book Day later. I was like 16 months of getting to write car chases. Like I'm never going to get that opportunity again. That's like super fun. I love doing that. So, so I watched all the cartoons. I had to, in the same way that I did for Space Ghost. I was like, I got to mainline all this mythology and just figure out like what are the core landmarks here. And the thing that really struck me about Speed Racer, it's funny, all these books tie into something in my life. Space Ghost is, you know, it reflects. I'm the older brother of a set of triplets. They were born like a week and a half before my ninth birthday. So, that book is about what it's like to be living in a certain way and then start everything blows up and you have to start counting things in threes, you
Yeah.
know. And sort of this idea of you know the kids kind of blow up your life, but in the same way they give you that room to build yourself up to be the type of person you're supposed to be, that you're meant to be, a better person, better version of yourself. Captain Planet is this idea of the ultimate friend hangout group, because I do remember what it was like to be an only child, and so like I learned how to make friends quickly, and this idea of like having these sort of people come from different walks of life, but they're with you thick and thin. That's, I think, that's the core appeal beyond everything else to me. Speed Racer, it's about somebody chasing after their passion. And so that's the thing I love about this book is that it really is the idea of somebody I can relate as a comic book creator. As a comic book writer, I grew up, I loved reading comics. That's been a lifelong passion. But the idea of then doing it yourself, and then not just doing it yourself, but going from like sort of the indie track to like suddenly being in a much bigger spotlight, I can relate to that in a very personal way because that's my life.
Right.
And so the idea of Speed, really the whole racer family, it's all about passion. They
Mhm.
love racing, and yet they each approach it in a different way, you know.
Right.
And there's a degree of conflict to it as well, you know, Speed is chasing after the ghost of his brother Rex,
Right. Yes.
that he's trying to live up to that legacy, because that's sort of that's the way he feels closest to his lost brother. Pops, meanwhile, like he sees racing through designs. He's a tinkerer, but at the same time, this sport also took away his firstborn son. And so he's got a huge degree of conflict about that to the point where, same as in the original cartoon, he doesn't want Speed to race. And it's sort of only as you'll see in issue one, circumstances must. Speed will have to go from this sort of back alley racing to going to Formula X, the real deal. And so, Trixie, meanwhile, like she's the Carol Ferris to Speed's Hal Jordan. She's a team owner. And so that's sort of her way of dealing with family legacy and also her way of sort of exploring the sport that she grew up loving. But at the same time, there's a degree of anxiety and a burden to
Mhm.
her of like this company is what I have left of my father, and how do I keep it afloat? And so she and Speed, they kind of come that's their common purpose, and then we go through the will they or won't they of their romance. Even Spritel, I see him as sort of like he's Speed's like in-house color commentator.
Right.
And so, the fact that all these different people are sort of exploring that passion through different angles. Rex even, Racer X, racing it's his way of setting of balancing the scales, of setting
Right.
things right.
Mhm.
That's how he's chasing after revenge, but also he wants to protect, his brother, even though he doesn't, even though he's not revealing his identity to try to keep him safe. Um, and I think that idea of like, you have to have a certain degree of confidence to be to do anything, really, being a comics creator, but anything else. But at the same time, when you go from indie to pro,
Mhm.
that's a learning curve, and you have to ask yourself, like, can I do this? Can I live up to the pressure? Can I deliver, or like, am I going to choke? And I think that becomes a lot of Speed's arc. I pitched this book as Rocky in a race car.
Yeah.
And so we're going to see kind of how Speed goes from these very humble beginnings, to becoming an actual professional race car driver. And then
Mhm.
how do you go from that to, the trials and tribulations you have to deal with along the way if you want to win the championship?
Right.
So, um, yeah, I love Speed because I think that idea of somebody chasing their passion, that generally means that they've got strong passions. Like, not to sound too hoity and toity about it, but like I see Speed as, he kind of reminds me of Hamlet in a
Yeah.
way. This character who, he's chasing after something bigger than himself, and when he's in the zone, that is where he's meant to be. But also, he's got these low lows, and but he's also, the spark that he has with Trixie is like undeniable. um he's such a fun character. And I think the thing that I love most about Speed Racer is, when I've written superheroes for a while now, and I love writing superheroes, don't get me wrong, I love doing it. um, that's, I feel like, the genre I was put on this earth to write. However, if you have to balance the characters, and you have to balance their powers, and you have to balance the mythology, and you have to balance the world-shaking stakes, and after a while, that eats up a lot of space, and it can turn into a crutch. You can start to forget how to write normal people.
Yeah.
And so what I love about Speed Racer is there's none of that. There's no costumes, there's no, code names, there's none of that. The only power, so to speak, is the car,
Right.
and we are, adding some elevated touches to the Formula X cars, as you saw in issue
Mhm.
zero, just to kind of, nod to all the tech from the original show.
Of course.
But yeah, I think the fact that you can't lean on powers, you can't really lean on a shared universe, you can't lean on
Mm.
continuity. It means you got to be really digging into the human side of it, the soap opera of it all. The stakes are very personal for Speed. It's not just pride of can I be a champion, as you'll see in issue one and issue two. The stakes are much higher and much more personal for him. But also, you see like the dynamic with him and Trixie. You see sort of his Speed is a character that's defined by his relationships, whether it's Trixie or Rex or Racer X or Pops or even Spritle. And so it's very dialogue driven, more than I was expecting, to be honest.
Mhm.
And so it does take a little bit of extra time and polish to kind of like get that right. And that's even before like David Tinto, who's an amazing artist. He's doing such a sensational job in this book. He'll add in his own flourishes to the mix. He's got a lot of thoughts as far as like the choreography is concerned. And so it takes a little bit longer. I have to be a little more deliberate about it, I think. But I think it's ultimately the best kind of conditioning because don't get me wrong, I love all the big world shaking stuff. I love building on continuity. I love everything that superheroes have to offer. But ultimately, what the business that we're in direct market comics for the most part is
Mhm.
it's one part action movie, one part soap opera.
Right.
And I think oftentimes there can be a trend where like we're losing out on that soap opera that makes all of the spectacle worthwhile.
Yeah.
And so it suddenly feels like a cake that's 90% icing with very
Mhm.
little cake underneath. And so I think a book like Speed Racer is a good reminder, certainly for me, of like, it's the humans. It's the human qualities that make all the action and spectacle worth it. And so being able to double down on that, it's been a real treat, and a real challenge, but in the best possible way.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm glad you said that because uh especially when you were talking about um the soap opera element, because
Yeah.
one of my favorite uh stories growing up was Dark Phoenix Saga. And
Yeah.
you don't have that emotional, like it is as wonderful as all the space battles and the action and the Shi'ar and all of that coming together and then pulling the X-Men from Earth. You don't have that moment where Jean sacrifices herself
Yeah.
to save Scott. Then you don't like. Then it's just beautiful pictures that don't tell a good story. And
Yeah. I think, and to riff on what you were saying, like when you boil Dark Phoenix down, it
mm,
really is the story of like it's a bunch of people trying to sort of staged intervention for their friend and then trying to keep them out of even bigger trouble, and knowing that they're all going to get stomped, but they're like, well, but it's Gene, we can't leave Gene in the hands of these people. We don't know what they're going to do. And yeah, I think sometimes I think that's a little bit of a lost art. I do think that there's sometimes a contingent where, it's more obsessed with like power scaling or like what's the implications for this corner of the mythology. And I think maybe that's probably, don't get me wrong. Again, I love writing in shared universes. I've done it before, but it's kind of a nice palate cleanser to be working on something like Space Ghost or Captain Planet or Speed Racer is probably, like Speed Racer, there's very little in the way of I can kind of cherry pick the elements that I want.
mhm.
And unlike the other two books, Speed Racer, because this is the beginning of sort of a shared universe, is kind of overselling it, but like there are going to be other books that spin off of my book that sort of they take place in the same universe, but they are going to have sort of their own specific vibes and flavors, based on the creators involved. Like I know, like Mark Russell, we've already announced, is doing a Racer X spin-off book, and so he's got kind of a different vibe than what we're doing. So yeah, I think it's very easy to sort of just treat these characters as costumes, you know,
Mhm.
as vessels for powers. I think even, at their best, sometimes we can at least lean into the metaphor of it all, like Jeff Johns' Green Lantern, as being a symbol of conquering your innermost fears. But I think sometimes, and there are other times where, we get some really cool uh superhero stories. We just talked about Dennis Camp's Ultimates, and
Yeah.
I love the way that he's like really pushing the boundaries of everything with Absolute Martian Manhunter. He
Mhm.
and his artist on that. So yeah, I think ultimately, like, making comics about other comics, like, I think that leads to diminishing returns. And I think,
Yeah.
unfortunately, we are in a position where that's happening a little bit,
Yeah.
because everybody's, they feel like building up on continuity is sort of a way that maybe we'll create a character that sticks.
Hmm.
But I do think that sometimes writing comics about other comics, it feels very insular. It feels very self-referential. Tom Brevoort just talked about something a little similar to that in his newsletter. It was either yesterday or the previous Sunday, talking
Okay.
about like dynastic comics, where like everybody's a superhero and they don't know any normal people, and they're just,
Mhm.
they're superheroes dealing with superhero problems, and like, okay, but like, what about like saving human beings? Like, that's what makes a superhero a superhero, in Tom's eyes and in mine. Um, so a book like Speed Racer, where you just don't have to worry about any of that, you can just
Mhm.
focus on the story in front of you and the characters and the cast in front of you. It's a real gift, and something that I don't think you often. It's becoming a more endangered species in today's direct market, and so it's something that I really am excited to sink my teeth into.
And I have a question regarding just kind of the logistics of what you do, because
Yeah.
between Speed Racer and Captain Planet and Cable and Space Ghost,
Yeah.
do you kind of sequester time off? This is that I'm just, for the next few weeks I'm deep into Speed Racer, and then after that for the next like 3 weeks I'm deep into Captain
I
Planet. Kind of how
wish.
does that? Yeah.
So I triage it on a week to week basis. It's always sort of which you learn the calculus pretty fast of just like how fast is the artist on this book. So you can sort of guesstimate how much time you have, and then you're just figuring out, okay, like I turned in this script at this point. This means that I will owe the next issue probably the next 4 weeks, and so you just kind of triage based on that. Sometimes you have to make a judgment call. Like, I've had a couple of times in the last year where like suddenly like two artists turn in pages at the same time. And so then you have to kind of make a judgment call of like who's going to need pages faster because they're a slower artist versus, that's the best part of working with Jonathan Lau, and also the worst part about working with Jonathan Lau is the guy draws like a damn Terminator. Like that guy can I've had issues where he's like, oh yeah, I cranked that thing out in less than 3 weeks. And I'm like, great, but I still have other books that I have to write. So knowing that Jonathan sometimes can kind of pick up that slack. It's not something I like to do, but every once in a while it's unavoidable. Um, but yeah, it's just week to week. I'm just like, what's the most pressing assignment that I need to work on? That's the thing I'm going to work on. It's so I'm at the point where I can reliably crank through a script in about a week. Usually what I do is like I give myself a day to panel things out. Every once in a blue moon, it'll take me two if it's more complicated or if it's just not clicking. And then I try to write 4 to 5 pages a day after that. And so that usually can get me in a good spot. But like, for example, last week I was working on an issue of Space Ghost, and the deadline was certainly kind of breathing down my neck. And so I wrote 13 pages in a day. It's not something I love doing, but I think for me, I've been very fortunate in that the books have sort of more or less like reached an equilibrium. Cable, for example, I was done with before I really dug deep into Speed Racer.
Mhm.
Uh, and so like I was able to kind of, that was a tricky one that, where I had like a month or two where I was writing 4 books a month. And that's hard going. I don't know how like somebody like Jed McKay was doing that, when he was doing like Blood Hunt and Strange and Moon Knight and Avengers
Yeah.
and gearing up for X-Men. That must have been brutal. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's just, it's like that Calvin and Hobbes strip where, they talk about like how to, what's your creative inspiration? And they're saying something like, deadline panic.
Yeah.
I mean, that's it, it becomes sort of this dance, and I'm still figuring it out myself. Is how do you sort of continue to do the work and do it in a timely fashion, knowing that looming deadline is a good extra push, but that you don't get so close to it that it starts to like drive you insane. And I've certainly had weeks or months where I'm just like, oh, how do I do all this? And you just put nose to grindstone and you do it. But yeah, I think the for me the best way to do it is, you break down the script into something manageable,
Right.
and that's why I work very hard at my outlines. When I pitched Space Ghost, I think I pitched them like a 35-page document.
Mm.
Uh, but that document had everything in every single issue. And then in the comments, I would have a beat sheet where I broke it down page to page. And that winds up being very helpful to me because, a year from now, when I'm writing these things, like, God help me if I was trying to remember everything I wrote a year ago.
Right.
But since it's already written down, since it's already paced out, and usually my pacing is I'm usually pretty good with it. Like sometimes like there's a page or two I want to adjust, but otherwise I'm within range. And then, that's why I do paneling. I break down each of those pages panel to panel. So I have sort of an idea in my mind of how could I break this down. And then it just becomes kind of Rubik's cubing the dialogue, and that's usually the toughest part for me. I had a conversation with some other pros about this a few weeks ago where are you a dialogue first person or are you a panel first person?
Right.
I'm a panel firster, but there are people who have said like, I don't know how you do that, meanwhile, I'm like, I don't know how you do dialogue first without like grossly overwriting the thing. So I don't think there's any wrong approach other than getting it done, but it really is it's breaking it down bit by bit and then trying to be as flexible as you can when just like inevitably stuff pops up. Like, I'll get an email from an editor being like, "Hey, we need a lettering pass on something now," and I'm like, "Great, that's my day," or you know, I'll get colors, or I'll get art, and I need to give notes, and I'm like, "Okay, that's probably an hour or two of time that I hadn't budgeted," and you just kind of adjust properly. But also, there's a lot of weekend work, there's a
Yeah.
lot of sort of like trying to like gauge like do I need to do this travel, like what's that going to cost me as far as scripts are concerned, but also trying to be cognizant that like you can't like work all day every day for months on end, like you need to like have a break. Like I always try every Friday, like I try to unplug, and like I try to just like order a pizza and watch a movie with my wife, so it's a dance that I wish I could say I've ironed out. It's certainly a work in progress, but I feel like I'm in a good spot currently where like I'm working on 3 books, and that's it. Like three, I think is like my nice sweet spot. But if I need to do like a month or two with four, like it can happen. But I would prefer it not to.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to ask. Was like, I mean, between the three books you're working on, and you got
Yeah,
the new issue of Space Ghost coming out this week,
yeah,
and wrapping up Cable
yeah.
and Captain. You got Captain Planet going, and you're about to start like really deep diving into Speed Racer. So, like, is there anything else on your plate right now, or are you
No,
just like
thank
going
mercifully not at the moment. I have 10-Ton Titan Terrier, which is my all ages graphic novel coming out through Paper Cuts in October, but that has been long written and long finished. We in fact sent that thing to the printer a couple weeks ago. So that's just like that's free money. That's a free space on my bingo card. I'm super thrilled for that book coming out. And then yeah, I wrapped up on Cable earlier in the year. I think it was around February. And we sent that thing to the printer a few weeks ago, the last issue. So yeah, right now it's those 3 books, but like I'm already like we're sort of wrapping up contracts on like another creator owned thing that I don't really know the timing on that. But what I can say is it'll be another horror book with me and Alex Cormick,
Right.
uh, teaming up again after The Devil That Wears My Face.
Mhm.
And then beyond that, it's sort of keeping myself open to other work. Um, there's another licensed property that like I had a conversation about earlier in the month that like
Mhm.
maybe playing around in that wheelhouse, and so we're trying to see if that, we can figure out the timing on that and find like the right angle and the right fit and the right project. But um, I'm so thrilled with the three that I've got
Yeah.
that I anything else is kind of the cherry on top. And of course, it's part of being a freelancer is that you're always kind of knocking on doors and just being like, hey, like my schedule is going to open up at such and such a time. And so, um, the dance really is sort of like triaging things to make sure that you're not like taking on too many new things at
Right.
once. Um, it was kind of a weird fluke thing that like Captain Planet and Speed Racer both like kind of materialized in the same weekend, and then
Mhm.
the Bad Cave and Dynamite made me official offers on that book during my honeymoon a few months later. So that was like a very eventful honeymoon, but like I
Yeah.
was like, oh, I have to go back now and watch a whole bunch of old cartoons to like make sure I know what I'm doing. So yeah, it's those for now, but I'm sure that will change in the coming months because a freelancer's hustle never stops.
Yeah, absolutely. And once again, was there, if you wanted people to follow you on socials, where can they find
Yeah. You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Pepose D. It's just my last name, first initial. You can follow me at David Pepose Comics on Facebook. You can visit my website, davidpepose.com, or subscribe to my newsletter, Pep Talks, at bit.ly/pep news.
you? All right. Well, I'm gonna let you get back to work because I know you've got books to write, and I have books that I want to read that you
Well,
write.
it's my pleasure to be here. I always love catching up with you, and thank you again for all the support. Thank you for everyone listening, for supporting my work. It keeps my puppy fed and kibble. You can pre-order Space Ghost, Captain Planet, Speed Racer at your local comic shop. Cable Love and Chrome is going to wrap up in 2 weeks, and also 10 Ton Titan Terrier, which is available for pre-order. That's coming out October 7th.
All right, and links to that will be in the notes for this episode. All right, so,
Thank you
David,
so much for having me.
oh, no problem. I appreciate you being on. I really do. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
Once again, I want to thank David Pepose for being on the fan cast this week. The new issue of Space Ghost will be in stores this Wednesday. The first issue of Captain Planet is currently available. As always, you can find me on Facebook, on X, on Instagram, on Blue Sky, and on TikTok. So for Superpowered Fancast, this is Darren signing off.